Hello and welcome to World Talks with me, Ashim Kumar. The Middle East remains on edge as President Donald Trump pauses plans for new military strikes on Iran, betting instead on diplomacy to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and curb Tehran's nuclear ambitions. Can negotiations succeed, or is another escalation inevitable? Well, joining us is Scott Lucas. He's Professor of American Studies at University College Dublin. Scott, welcome back to TP World. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Pleasure as always. So tell us, Professor, what's behind President Trump's push for a diplomatic resolution?
Well, as always, I think you have to start by pushing Trump's bluster and his tweets aside and get to the political and military realities. And the key military reality to this goes back 10 days to a week ago last Friday. There was a key meeting with all the top advisors, political and military, at the Camp Retreat in Maryland. And the military told those assembled that, look, you can expand your attacks on Iran, but first of all, we've got a shortage of air defense interceptors, so we can't protect other countries if Iran retaliates. Then they said, look, what else are we going to hit in Iran? We've hit these targets over and over again. The regime still hasn't surrendered. We're actually running out of places that we can bomb. And given that some of Trump's advisors, notably the Vice President J.D. Vance, are already opposed to the war, that pretty much ruled out expanding the war. Now, what happened over the weekend is that Trump is feeling boxed in. He doesn't have a military option to force the regime to surrender. Iran is not going to concede over its conditions for the talks, especially its control of the Strait of Hormuz. And so he thumps his chest and he blusters, I'm going to hit them, I'm going to hit them. And then, of course, just before the stock markets open on Monday, and also with an eye on the oil and gas prices, then he retreats. He backs away from this. The fundamental is this, if I may, and that is the key talks going on right now are actually bilateral talks between Iran and Oman. That's the Arab state to the south of the Strait of Hormuz over management of the waterway. What the Iranians are trying to do is to get an agreement with Oman to sort of establish the terms before they go back into talks with the Americans. And I think we have to see what happens there. But at the very least, we're still in the same dilemma we've been in for months. And that is, unless the Trump camp recognize that Iran has a stake in management of the Strait of Hormuz, there won't be significant talks. There won't be a way out of this. And we'll be in this limbo where we might get military skirmishes, but I doubt we'll get a return to all-out war.
Right. Well, I don't think there's ever been any doubt that Iran has a stake in managing Hormuz. It's just that the use of the Strait of Hormuz as a weapon of war, which Iran has been doing. I mean, America has not been particularly successful in undermining that use of the Strait, which of course has had all sorts of economic issues rise up as a result. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I agree. I guess I should clarify specifically that because Iran, as you noted, has fired on vessels that have used the Strait of Hormuz without its permission. And that goes back to this memorandum of understanding we had in June, where we did have the prospect of talks to try to reach a resolution. Donald Trump signed that memorandum of understanding without consulting his senior advisors. And the problem for the administration here is that it clearly recognized Iranian management of the Strait of Hormuz, but some people in the administration didn't like that, and indeed a lot of people in Washington didn't like that. So the Trump administration backed off, and what it tried to do in June and July was to encourage ships to use a route outside, that was along the Omani coast, thinking they could break effectively the Iranian control. That's when the Iranians fired on some of those ships that were using the Oman route. That's when the Americans retaliated by hitting targets inside Iran, and then Iran retaliated by hitting targets in the Gulf states. So in other words, that escalation that we've had, which goes back several weeks periodically, all goes back to that June memorandum of understanding where Donald Trump had agreed effectively to negotiate on Iran's terms, including over the Strait of Hormuz, and then his administration tried to back out of it.
Okay, now the other aspect, of course, is the U.S. oil reserves are also at one of their lowest levels in decades. Now, how much pressure is that putting on President Trump to get the straits opened again and talks going again?
I mean, I think that is a longer-term pressure, not just U.S. Oil reserves, but global oil reserves, which, as you noted, are also at amongst their lowest level in decades. I don't think, however, that's the immediate pressure on Trump. I think the more immediate is that with any restriction on the Strait of Hormuz, you could always have an increase in the oil and gas prices. If the oil and gas prices increase, then U.S. gasoline prices, petrol prices increase. And that's the first thing Americans look at when they consider their economic situation. You know, we're very much a car-dependent nation. You have petrol stations every few hundred yards. And so that signal, especially once we get into the final stretch of the congressional campaign in September, before we get to November's elections, I think if the Trump folks still face those rising gasoline prices, and they're still about 40% higher than they were at the start of the war, then I think the Trump folks have got no alternative but to come back to the negotiating table.
Right, now Saudi Arabia has offered to play a role in the negotiations, but you mentioned Oman. Why Oman?
Well, Oman is specifically relevant because it is the Arab country that is right on the Strait of Hormuz. It's on the southern coast of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran is to the north of the strait. However, you're absolutely right to highlight Saudi Arabia's key role here. Saudi Arabia has been playing both sides throughout the war. They wanted the Americans to knock out the Iranian regime. They were upset that the war had caused this Iranian retaliation against them. And they told the Americans, if you're going to do this, finish the job. But when the Trump folks wouldn't or couldn't finish the job, then Saudi Arabia swung behind a path of negotiation, specifically behind Pakistan, one of the two mediators. Now, what has happened in recent days is that when Donald Trump threatened to escalate the war, as we mentioned, with these renewed airstrikes, and after his military told him of the difficulties, Saudi Arabia piled on the pressure. There was a phone call between Trump and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, the effective leader. And Mohammed bin Salman said, look, unless you are going to step up this military action where you can take the regime out, we're not going to support it. And I think the combination of Saudi Arabia's intervention and those military factors is why Trump blustered, but then backed away over the weekend.
Right. Now, zooming out a little bit, I mean, this whole thing started because of Iran's nuclear ambitions. It sounds as though that they can do as they please going forward. Maybe they've had some setbacks recently, but nothing stopping them rebuilding, is there?
I sort of have to agree with you halfway there. In terms of the start of the war, back on February the 28th, using Iran's nuclear program was simply a pretext for the war, because Iran, of course, did not have a nuclear weapon, and Iran was in talks with the United States to limit its uranium enrichment. What really turned the Trump folks towards the war was this idea of projecting American power, and it was the Israelis, because the Israelis told them, if you kill the supreme leader, it'll be an easy win, because Iranians will rise up against the regime, and that didn't happen. Now, where we are now is that the nuclear issue has become secondary to the Strait of Hormuz issue, and in fact, the Trump administration has sort of backed away from its original demand, which was for Iran to cease all uranium enrichment, even for civilian programs. In fact, when we did have talks, that brief period of talks where the Vice President J.D. Vance was involved, Vance nodded to the fact that Iran could continue to have an enrichment program, albeit at a lower level than it is now. So I actually don't think the nuclear issue is paramount here. I don't think it's the key one. I think it still is the Strait of Hormuz, because although the Trump administration won't admit it, we can get back to the 2015 agreement over Iran's nuclear program that had been negotiated by the Obama administration and by 5 other powers.
But then ignored by Iran, because they did exceed the limits that they had agreed to. Professor Scott Lucas, as always, thank you so much for coming along and sharing your analysis with our audience. Have a great day.
Thanks to you.
Thanks. Bye
Thanks
now.
to you and your great viewers.
Thank you.
Bye.
And that brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, lots more coming up. Goodbye.